Today, I want to talk a little bit about what I consider next steps in the application process. So, for me, for example, when I work with my students, we talk about the application, getting ready for the application. That is part of the process. Once you hit submit, though, you're not completely done. So, I like to set this up as sort of a series of reminders that I share with students all of the time. Let me first take a step back and I'm going to talk about what it means to actually have a completed application. Students are in charge of submitting their application form, whether that comes through the Common App, the Coalition, or a school-based form specifically. That is something that they must do, and they must do it by the publicized deadline, so they know they know that. They cannot, that is not negotiable. They must submit the application by that deadline. However, that doesn't make a completed file for a student. So the variations can be wide in terms of what does, but let's talk about the most basic things. There has to be some form of a transcript or grade report. Sometimes there has to be test scores if you're applying test optional. Obviously, that's not the case. There may be teacher recommendations or counselor recommendations involved, and oftentimes there's something called the school report that has to be taken care of. So, student is responsible for the primary application, and sometimes the grade report, if it is a self-reported grading system that they have to take care of, or if they are asked to upload a copy of their transcript, that would be something they are required to do. They are usually also required to take care of test scores if they are submitting those. So whether that is directly from the College Board for SATs or the ACT, or perhaps the college allows them to upload their own score report or simply type their scores into the application and considers those as part of the application process. Important that students understand all of these distinctions because it is part of this process. Again, there are steps that go beyond just hitting submit on the actual application. Then high schools are generally going to be in charge of submitting recommendations. Those are supposed to remain confidential. So the high school will coordinate teacher recommendations and counselor recommendations that need to be submitted. The high school counselor is responsible for a school report if that is required. Then oftentimes they are also responsible for the transcript. Many colleges still would like to have an official copy of the transcript, which means it is sent directly from the high school by the counselor, usually transmitted electronically, again, but something that the student isn't necessarily having a hand in, but that can vary. So students really have to understand what are all of the steps that they are specifically responsible for in this process. So how do you figure that out? Well, you do some research ahead of time, but post submitting the application, the next steps that are going to happen are generally there's going to be some form of an email communication from the college acknowledging receipt of the application, and then often in that same message explaining to the student that they need them to then set up their online portal. It will include a link to how to do that and temporary credentials to get the student started on that process. So the student needs to do that as soon as they get that message. And once you've done that, the student can then see what are the pieces of the application that have been received by the college. So generally, you're going to see that your application is actually there because that's what generated the message to set up the portal in the first place. But then there will likely be a checklist of the additional items that they are either waiting for or that they have received. Oftentimes it's a big red X if they don't have it and a big green check mark if they do, but the student is then responsible for checking and seeing what is outstanding at that point. Now, here's where things get a little bit tricky at times. Students are checking these, and sometimes it's pretty quickly after they've submitted that application. And then they sometimes see, oh my goodness, my transcript hasn't been sent by my high school counselor, or my teacher recommendations are not there, and they start to panic. And what I'm here to remind everybody about right this minute is that is if it's that quick, it is not the time to panic, because even though things are being transmitted electronically, you submit your application, 24 hours later you look at your portal, your high school may not have even hit submit yet on the extra materials that they are responsible for sending. So try not to panic at all when that happens. Now, if a week or more goes by, then there's probably some investigation that needs to happen. But instantaneously is not a real thing in this process. Even though, again, things are being sent electronically, on the college's side, they need to download information, then it gets matched to the student's files. That doesn't happen in the blink of an eye just because you hit submit, even from like sending your test scores or something like that. So taking a deep breath and remembering it doesn't all happen instantly. So tips to help with this. A, apply early. Get the application in ahead of the deadline so that you have a little more breathing room to make sure that all of those materials have arrived. However, pro tip, that this is something that is generally true at most universities. Colleges usually allow extra time for those additional supporting materials to arrive. So for example, if an application deadline is October 15th, the student is the one who is bound by that deadline of submitting the application. Then often the college will then give the high school or even the student, if they're submitting their test scores, extra time, almost up to 2 weeks usually, to then submit the supporting materials. So say it's October 15th, then by November 1st, everything else needs to have arrived to ensure that the file is complete. So again, the earlier you do it, the more time you have to ensure those next steps are taking place and allowing everybody a little more breathing room. The other thing I will add really quickly is that it's very important that students understand what their high schools need from them in order to submit these materials. There are usually steps involved of how you report the list of schools that you're applying to, how you then request transcripts and report that you have submitted your applications, and all of those steps are important to trigger the high school to then send along the materials that they are responsible for. And last thing, again, students must understand what exactly everyone is responsible for, because it varies. If you follow along, you hear me say this all the time, we do not have a standardized process for college applications in this country. So colleges vary in terms of where they ask for these materials to come from and who is responsible for them. Students must be diligent in trying to figure that out at the beginning of the process. That is certainly something that we are helping our students understand as we work together with them. And if we can be of any help to you, please reach out.